Back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Griffith of Virginia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I greatly appreciate it. As far as old talking points go, the reason that we have old talking points is that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle aren't listening. The negotiations that take place with the drug manufacturers that were included in the IRA and originally in H.R. 3 are such that the government comes in, they tell you we're going to negotiate. You can't talk about it if you're a drug manufacturer, and if you don't agree to the price that we're going to offer you, we're going to take 95% of your sales. That's not much of a negotiation unless you're the godfather. Exclusivity is also a problem in the IRA because of the fact that particularly with small molecule treatments, the exclusivity period is so short that companies have told me they may take their trials overseas and medicine may not be available as quickly in the United States. All right, that said, back to my questioning. I understand that Dr. Britton, I understand that nearly a third of all products requiring coverage with evidence development since 2005 were for cardiovascular medical products. Furthermore, I understand that registry costs in the case of the transcatheter valve therapy registry are roughly $25,000. And as you've said, you've talked about it as being burdensome, and the staff hours and resources are a real challenge for both providers and their patients, especially in rural areas. So what do we do about the rural areas? How are the registries set up funding-wise? Does the industry help rural areas get started? Is there a process to help the startup?
So thank you very much, Congressman Griffith, for the question. This is obviously a major focus for us now, particularly with the fact that we've learned from the TVT registry that we do have inequities in care, particularly in rural areas. So we are making great efforts. I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think one of the drivers of this is actually the limitations that come as resource limitations within the NCD. So the NCD has listed the number of sites that can be involved in TAVR. That's not necessarily have anything to do with CED. We're learning the information from CED that tells us about the inequities in care. So we're trying to then develop strategies to address those. And one of those is the limitations that are provided, as I mentioned, from the NCD. So there are resources. The resources generally come from the guidance of the NCD. So that's one area that I think we can potentially suggest that we need to actually approach. Other areas are the fact that we need really grassroots effort to actually get those patients that are, racial disparities actually addressed directly. It's not just inequities in care in rural, but it's also we have within the inner cities, we actually have racial disparities as well. And we're learning that through the actual CED and the TVT registry directly. So how do we do that? We need a strategy. And the strategy is that we need to think about, even if you're in a large city, and people suggest that, as I mentioned earlier, we have TAVR centers in all states, and at the time that we came up with this strategy, we were really trying to roll out, as I mentioned, the safe and most appropriate way to bring this life-saving therapy to patients. But that was at the time. We've learned now from that. And the action is, can we bring access to more patients? That means bringing in those technologies into the rural communities directly. And right now, whether you're in the rural communities or in the inner city, sometimes it takes jumping on a bus for multiple hours to actually get to something that's 12 miles away. And so that's impossible for access for some actual providers and for some patients. And so we need to think about the fact that we've actually distributed these centers in a way that doesn't necessarily provide equal access. And so that's now what the TVT registry has provided us. And so then once we have the ability to open further centers, we then have the ability to actually provide this care to the rural areas themselves.
Yeah, I am concerned because Alzheimer's affects us all. And I'm just wondering, are we doing enough in the rural areas? And I'm not against talking about the inner cities as well, and I understand it may take a while because sometimes we have a problem with people look at a map and they say, in my district, they say, well, it looks like it's only this far apart. What they don't know is there's two mountains in the way, and what might take, if you're just driving the mileage at 65 miles an hour, might only take you 15 minutes, but to get around the mountain, you're not going 65 miles an hour. So I recognize your bus analogy, but I'm really concerned about the rural areas that people are not being served, and I'm particularly concerned with comments that Ms. Wronski brought up that that they're not being served. Ms. Wronski, what do you think? What do we need to do in the rural areas?
That's a great question.
Should we get rid of the registry for the people who are trying to do it in those rural areas or where they're underserved, whether it be inner city or rural? I mean, I know the registry can help, but can it prohibit health?
I think it can. I think it can be prohibitive. Absolutely. We do have a lot of issues with outreach in some rural states where we only have one Alzheimer's chapter for resources alone. Those are areas that aren't being touched by things like this. So we absolutely, it can be prohibitive. Again, very much in favor of continuing the process of learning more about these drugs. But I think where a patient has proven that they have the disease and they are in need of treatment and the treatments are available, we believe that they should have access to them.
I appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, as you know, but maybe the folks back home or around the country and maybe their witnesses don't know, my district landmass is larger than 9 states. I'm east of the Mississippi. I'm one of the largest, if not the largest, east of the Mississippi, and I have a lot of rural people who don't get health care. I yield back.